So hello everyone, my name is Dimitri. I am a clinical budgets and logistics manager at Urgent Pharma for past 7.5 years. I'm a registered nurse. Before that I had a background in IT and electronic commerce, so I know it's not related, but it kind of helps in the clinical research field. I'm sorry, I'm like super worried, not worried, but like stage anxiety. Yeah.
The lights are bright.
So I manage budgets for the whole clinical departments. I negotiate budgets with all the clinical sites that we have across, I think 5 or 6 trials that we have run. So I was in the company since the first in-human trial up till just recently we submitted the NDA for our phase 3 in UGN 101. So kind of the whole suite of different kinds of studies, small, mid, big ones, and all kinds of phases. And I don't know.
Thank you. We'll just move on to Perry.
Hi, I'm Perry Steinberg, Vice President of Product here at Medidata, responsible for the clinical trial financial management. I also have responsibility for our content capabilities. I've been in the financial industry for 20 years, starting at Accenture, building bespoke financial systems and planning. So really my expertise is all about driving financial success from budget to payments. And so when we think about the clinical trial financial management suite, starting from designing a protocol all the way through kind of reconciliation, including the budgeting and payments, it's really my specialty. And I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about that.
Hi, my name is Deborah Arujo, and I'm the founder of ClinBiz, and we provide educational content for clinical trial professionals on contract, negotiations, CRO, so business aspects of clinical trials, we call it. And we also provide some niche consulting in these areas as well. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Donald Libretti-Cook, Head of Contracting and Budgeting at Bayer, which is part of a new global organization within Bayer. Prior to that, I was the U.S. Contracts Manager for Bayer for 3 years, and I've been in this global role for 2 years now.
Hi everyone, Amanda Eckenrode. I'm an engagement consultant here at Medidata, and I work with the clinical financial management suite of products. So I do everything from the protocol design through the budgeting and the payments. So I have experience working with all of our clients across enterprise, mid-market, and CROs, as well as running our managed service program. So I build budgets. I work with that process of it. I'm in your shoes as well, and know the goods and the bads of everything that we do with that. So.
Thank you. So we're going to try to keep this as interactive as possible, but before we get started with the discussion, I think it's important for us to level set on what do we mean when we talk about clinical trial financial management and what's Medidata's approach to that. So Medidata defines it as an end-to-end approach, starting with optimizing study design all the way through payments and then reporting and all the activities that are happening concurrently from a financial perspective during that process. So we're beginning with optimizing our study design, thinking about the costs that go into that so that you can create efficient budgets, and then using robust fair market values to negotiate and EDC to trigger your payments from an activity and a procedure perspective, all the way to then reporting and the compliance and transparency that comes with that. So how does technology fit in that? From Medidata's perspective, we see it as a mechanism of unifying that entire process and then enabling you to take a smarter approach to making financial decisions, but also gaining a lot of operational efficiencies through that way. We know that this isn't easy and that challenges come along the way, right? So it's big end-to-end processes, there's a lot of complexities, and we hear that from our CROs and our customers and our sponsors. So let's everyone get out their apps and open up the schedule. We're going to do a quick live poll. When you think about your organization's challenges from a clinical trial financial management perspective, which of these challenges, or which of these challenges is, I guess, your greatest one that you're currently facing? Is it late and inaccurate payments leading to site dissatisfaction? Is it your the cash flow issues that you have with escrow? Is it maybe a fragmented process? Maybe compliance around new accounting standards and global regulations? unreliable reporting and forecasting transparency, and then a lack of data to support that decision making. Does everyone have access to their apps? Okay, we'll give you a minute. Okay, 5 more seconds.
It's a quick one.
Looking forward to the results.
Okay, we've got Michelle's going to let us know what. Oh, so you have to go to your session for establishing site and study financial success, and there's a poll in there. Everyone else find it? Okay. What's the result? What's the biggest challenge?
Looks like 44% of you have picked fragmented and manual process efficiency.
Ah, perfect. That's what we're talking about, unifying.
We're going to solve the problem
Yeah,
here in this
okay,
room.
great. So let's turn it to our panel discussion. We're going to start with the beginning of this process. Oops. So first question, when we think about the budgeting process, where do you actually start that process when we're thinking about the beginning to start the site budgeting process? So it can start at different stages, and we had this discussion during our prep meeting. So maybe this is directed to Donna and Deborah. Would love to get your insights on that.
I'll give it a start.
Yeah.
So I think where most sponsors that we've worked with and we've talked with as well, where they usually start the site budgeting process is when protocol is either at the draft stage or a final protocol. And that's pretty much across the board where most study sponsors do. Now we've had a discussion that, perhaps, and I think a lot of the sessions before also touched on, the importance of going early and looking at, things very early on in the process when we're designing the study. And I think, a lot of the budgeting process is left to an afterthought, and it really needs to be placed very early on in those study design meetings, because there's a lot of value that you can bring to reducing costs and things like that when you're involved at the study design level as well. But where we see a lot of sponsors is starting at the final protocol or a draft protocol at best.
So because we've centralized budgeting within Bayer, we're still at the stage where we're developing the budget at the synopsis or protocol level 1, but we're able to give feedback because we do see a lot of changes and things that are implicating the budget that needs to be repaired. And lately, we're now joining feasibility calls, so that's actually new to collaborating with the feasibility group. And I hope to see more input from us at the feasibility stage early on. Indication of protocol feasibility.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Is anyone else here joining feasibility calls as the beginning of the process and involved with those teams? Okay. What about Amanda? What have you seen with other clients?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest strength is we know, ideally we would have a finalized protocol and then we develop our budget beyond that, but that's not the reality ever of what we're doing. So I think it's one of those things where when we do see these teams not working in silos, and that goes from trial design through payments as well, when the teams are actually collaborating a lot more, there's just a lot more efficiencies that come from that. And it helps, through the whole process. It allows you to look back for your next study and plan better, design the protocol better, and have the next budget make a little bit more sense as well. So that's ideal process for sure, if we can get there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about the next budget. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we're seeing in the conversations that are really sparking a lot of interest right now is around financial compliance. And financial compliance is driving a better understanding of, wait a minute, what was my last budget for a similar type of phase TA, and then saying, okay, well, I need to look at that and understand how I need to plan for that from a financial engineering perspective.
Yeah, I would actually add to that. We ran a couple of trials in a similar field, and the prices actually change year to year. So even though you can project, depending on the scale of the trial as well, there will be some differences. But as to when to start building budget, I would say as soon as possible. Even maybe before the synopsis, I usually just got how many patients, what are the procedures, what are we trying to achieve, that's it. So you build that, and as the protocol development continues, you just make necessary changes to the matrix of the budget. So I kind of develop my own system where I just need a handful of parameters that I put in, and on the back end I just receive up to like a monthly payments going out to the patients, and where I can see in a separation of all the pass-throughs where it's going, what's the startup, what's the closeout, what's the midsection of the trial is going to look like. It's kind of tied to a recruitment and the site initiation. So I'm trying to find out as much detail as possible, like how fast we want to run this trial, how long it's going to last, and yeah, and then you just change these parameters as the protocol develops, and yeah, you get more accurate numbers.
So in the perfect world, budgeting would, you'd budget perfectly and everything would go to plan. But we know that it's not always the case. So what, you guys have a lot of experience. So what have you learned from maybe mistakes that have happened in the past, or what would you advise as what you do to mitigate some of these risks that you've seen?
Well, I can give an example of a large study we were working on, and I think it's just a matter of knowing ahead of time those things are going to impact the budget. People in the study team didn't realize it, and it came down and impacted us. So moving forward, there were sister studies within this one study that happened. There were other within the compound. So we went and approached all the other study teams that were on the sister studies and say, listen, this is impacting all of our IRB fees as well as X, Y, and Z. We need to know this in advance because we had to do massive amendments and huge lessons learned. But a lot of it is the communication, the study team having to think about what are the reverberations down the line. And because we work closely with the study teams now, because we centralize, I think we've been able to make a stopgap in that.
One example I have a couple of years ago that we worked with one sponsor is that there was a protocol amendment for a very, very large phase 3 study, and unfortunately we were able to give some feedback during that protocol amendment development, and from a budget perspective, right, from a costing perspective. And it was interesting that as we got to look through those procedures, that sometimes we don't think about because it was so large a study and it was going to go on for so long, we were able to pick out some nice-to-have procedures versus must-haves, and we approached the study team, and they were very open in this particular situation to changing. And we said, do you really need these procedures, all of these procedures, in this frequency for the patients? And talking about it, and again thinking about patient centricity and also balancing costs, we were able to take those procedures out of that amendment, and it saved $15 million. For that phase 3, very large, and it was going to go on for a very long time. So just in looking at it, so I think it's sometimes mistakes that we look at is just putting in nice-to-haves versus must-haves in some of those site budgets discussions and procedures and things like that.
I think when you utilize the tools that Medidata offers as well, like this is one thing I see is that we have the patient burden index, we have the complexity metrics. So you're really able to utilize the tools and get a sense of when you're just doing too much in your study or maybe not enough. So even if the protocol is not perfect, we can figure out as we go and budget accordingly for that. I think that's one thing I always see some of the clients where they don't even know that these things exist. And so when you're looking at it, it's like, oh, okay, this complexity is so high. We're going to lose our patients at this point. We're not going to budget accordingly. And so there's good value that comes from paying attention to that through the process too.
So we use the Medidata's Edge Site Grants, which is formerly known as Grants Manager.
We're back to Grants Manager.
Are you back?
Yep.
Grants Manager. It's their fair market value tool.
Yeah.
So it's the tool that we use to go in and put in the visits and the procedures. You go by indication, and that's how we build the budget. And it shows us the low, medium, and high for the industry benchmarks, which is part of their PICUS database. And our obligation and our relationship with Medidata is to send our final site budgets back to Medidata so they can continuously feed their PICUS database. So that's actually site data. It's a finalized site budget of what's being paid out to the site. And that's how they, so when you go to build a budget the next time, and there's quarterly updates with their data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as a site, like you are getting the data that's at the discretion of the sponsor of like, how they want to budget, what they consider fair market value, and we could talk about that forever because that varies for everyone. But yeah, so we present the cost from a 25th to a 90th percentile of what's being negotiated in the industry, updated every quarter, and then the sponsor chooses what number that they want to negotiate with the sites and roll that out that way. So that's where it's coming from.
So I think this ties well into the next question. We recently did a webinar with SCRS, and in the webinar, SCRS told us about how only 30% of sites feel that the fair market value covers their costs. So it'd be great to get your guys' perspective on how do you ensure that you're using fair market values that are fair, but are also helping you achieve financial success for your studies.
Well, I guess I'll start. If that's okay. So, we in Eurogen also use the grants manager, and before that, I was actually going just straight to the Ministry of Health of different countries. They usually have like a price list of procedures. Like for example, I came from Israel, so we have. You can download basically like an Excel spreadsheet based on different insurance policies that are available in that country, and you can check what are the prices for that particular procedure or whatnot. So with using the grants manager, we sometimes did run into the issue that even if you take like industry mid values and you give it to the site, and during the negotiation process they just say, no guys, this is like just too low, this will cost like this much. So but there were other times when I came to just wanted to test myself, just sent an empty spreadsheet and let the site fill it out by themselves with the numbers they just wanted, whatever they want, right? And then you check against the Medidata's grants manager, they were actually sometimes lower than the grants manager was showing. So, I mean, it depends on the areas as well. I wouldn't take that risk with everyone, because I was just recently telling about we negotiated with the one site in Alaska that cost 3 times more than the site in New York. So, like, yeah, I mean, you need to kind of consider where and how you propose the budget to which hospitals.
Well, and I think the topic of fair market value too, like Amanda said, we could go on for days talking about that, because at least in the U.S., right, there's a couple of different federal mandates and federal guidances really on the topic of fair market value. So we really need to look at fair market value as a very robust topic and not simply as, you know, one thing. So as I mentioned when we talked about this panel is that, you know, one of the main things you do need to have is a good tool to start with, right, but that fair market value is much more robust than only a number, at least for the US, in terms of you need to have proper documentation in your process. You need to have a process in place. You need to have, you know, make sure that those things are verifiable, that they're auditable, and things like that. So a great tool is your basis for starting a great fair market value, but not to stop at only that. You really need to build out, you know, your process to ensure that, you know, you are, you know, in a good path as well when we talk about that.
So if we switch directions now and we think about site sustainability, what another aspect of it is, it's paying sites on time and accurately, right? So we also know from recent SCRS research that 66% of sites are operating on less than 3 months of cash. So before we jump into that topic, I want to do another poll, so everyone get out their phones. What is your organization's current payment terms? Is it less than 30 days as recommended by SCRS? Is it 90 days, 120 days, or 180 days? Greater than 100. Okay.
And I hope it's not anything more than that, but it might be.
Okay. Good?
All right, looks like you guys are 50-50 here, between less than 30 days and less than 90 days.
Okay. Okay. That's good.
Great.
Okay, so I'd like to understand from you, from the panel's perspectives, what is the biggest changes that you have made in your organizations or with other partners to achieve less than 30 days? Dimitri, maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I'll give an example of this trial that we ran. It's an oncology trial, UGN 101. We started the trial. It's 75 patients, about 45 sites. It's a rare disease. We thought, like, okay, I mean, it's not a lot of patients. Maybe we can just handle it in-house without any kinds of systems. So I have some experience in the procurement as well. So I know the ERP that the company was using at the time, and we decided to maybe we just try it and do it ourselves. So quickly, after like 9 patients, it was very cumbersome to just aggregate all the payments into one invoice, and then wait for the sites to actually, you first generate kind of like a request for invoice, send it over to them, they prepare the invoice, send it back to you, which is not a straightforward process whatsoever. And once I had to open the purchase orders in the ERP system, get my finance to transfer the money, which also not a straightforward process at all. And then I had to provide the site with the payment confirmation and get the receipt from them back to the finance. So this whole process took about a month and a half, 2, so in the best case. And then I just kind of felt that I just not keeping up with everything. So when I had a backlog of about 3 months, I'm like, that's it. We just need something else. So we went with Medidata. And right now we're running, basically I'm the only person handling the payments for 2 studies right now at the same time. And we always pay on time on the 1st of every month. We have a cutoff on the 17th of every month. So in a time frame of a week and a half, every payment is calculated, done, and transferred.
I think one of the things that I've seen in terms of best practices and in terms of how to gain that efficiency is kind of a slight spin on what Dimitri was talking about, and that is understanding your as-is process flow of how you get from point A to point B for a site payment, and identifying the bottlenecks in that process. And in this case, right, it had nothing to do with technology. There was a lot of handoffs, a lot of communication going back and forth. And that's something that technology isn't necessarily going to solve. It could help in terms of facilitating some of that conversations, and it could keep things organized, which is hugely beneficial. But really, kind of my experience is let's map out the as-is process, identify where the bottlenecks are, and how you can make the biggest improvements, and then focus the technology or focus efforts on how you improve those areas.
Yeah, agreed as well. Technology is not everything. It's really important, but it's not everything. But I would say, right, it's sort of a marriage, like you said, in the processes and the handoffs. So I guess it starts with our organization looking at what do you really want to accomplish, how you want to make sure your sites are financially viable, and what you want to do going forward, and then also committing to the right technologies, because I can say for many sponsors that we've seen, and it doesn't matter the size. Sometimes you're really still working with very cumbersome, very old technology, and it's not helping. So it's really committing to what you want out of that relationship with your sites and keeping them viable, and then acting on it, right? And it's like, and sometimes it means getting a good technology.
Yeah, we went through a very large change at Bayer. Being part of the former U.S. Contracts and Budgets group, I was heavily involved in payments, extremely painful manual process. And being part of a large organization, we had to have that come from the top down, that we were going to be putting sites first and improving site satisfaction with our payments. So we decided to bring in a consultant to help us process map, because it was pretty scary when we looked at our process and how many touch points and duplication that was occurring, and then went through the RFP process. So we're working with a third-party vendor, have automated payments for all new internally run U.S. studies, and we're in the process of rolling out to the rest of the world in waves. So the first 7 countries, we're starting to plan for that now, but it took 18 months to get there. It was big, it was revolutionary for us. And we've been able to get our payments down to 30 days in the US.
And when we think about scaling globally outside of the US, obviously that brings some different complexities. What do you think about when you're evaluating other tools and solutions and processes?
One of the things you definitely have to think about with your payments is you have to think of go backwards first, but you have to think about rest of world as tax implications. Are there any chances we're going to lose R&D credits and what have you? We're working on that right now with one of the countries, and it looks like we've gotten over the hurdle. And we chose certain 7 countries first and working with the vendor because they knew they could get over some of those hurdles. But that's a big one when you're initially thinking about rest of the world and rolling out.
And you also have to think about the cultural differences. So I know a couple countries in Italy, sorry, I keep on hitting. In some countries, they don't want to be paid every 30 days.
Yeah.
And so you need to also take in consideration the different cultural differences and the different tax implications as well when it goes to the rest of the world.
And Perry, what's Medidata's approach to?
Yeah, I think the dealing with the tax implications is a big piece of it, but then there's also the invoicing process. And each country has different invoicing procedures and needs. Do you pre-invoice? Do you not pre-invoice? Do you need to get certain tax capabilities from the site on the invoice or not? I think those are probably the 2 of the highlights. And it's something that when you start looking on a country-by-country basis, there are slight differences. And as we think about going global in terms of dealing with the sites, it's really important to make sure that you're recognizing what are the different countries and different requirements that you need to obtain.
I'll just add something very small. Be careful with the Eastern Europe as well.
Yeah.
Because we kind of just ran into this as well. They're actually prefer to get paid not to an institution, but to particular people that participate in that trial in the site. So instead of paying once, you'll have to pay like 10 times to the same place to 10 different people. So yeah, just something to keep in mind.
And from the budgeting perspective of that, before you even get to the payments, it's that one size does not fit all with creating these budgets. And you may be US based and create something, but rolling out to the other countries, there's additional line items, there's invoiceables, there's all the things that need to be captured and designed well. And we've seen some very poorly designed studies where the sites aren't going to be paid enough because we didn't account for everything that needs to happen in that location. So that's relying on your country expertise that you may have within your organization or services that can help you to do that as well becomes crucial before you even get to the payment side.
And then when we come to the end of this process, the reporting, and how do you ensure accurate reporting and transparency? And in the prep call, we were talking about it, and we joked, well, we just need a perfect system, right? But what would that perfect capability look like? And maybe Deborah, I know you've worked with a few different clients. Maybe you could comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of the sessions before, the keynote sessions mentioned as well, the adoption in our industry is a big deal, right? So even the adoption of good tools is something really we still struggle with within, study sponsors particularly. I call it adoptophobia. We have a big phobia about adopting new technologies. So I think it's looking at your processes, looking at what you have currently, seeing what's the best that you can do at that moment, of course, being practical, but then really looking at, sourcing things out. What are some good tools in the industry that you can do that, ways that you can find that reporting much easier. It's really gonna accelerate everything for your own teams, and it's gonna make it easier for your sites, in terms of being able to know their payments and things like that. It's gonna be helpful for your study teams so they can free up time to do more important things as well.
They talked about it in the keynote earlier too, of relying on the data that you have, and you're only as good as the data. And so looking at the study you maybe just finished and make sure that you're applying that to the next one as well. I think we're always in the go, and the next one comes before you're ready to even start planning. But relying on that data of what's been done and looking back becomes real crucial with that.
Okay, I think we want to turn it over to some questions in the audience. Does anyone have any questions? No?
I think one of the things, to go back kind of to the data and the reporting aspect, I think it's really important to tie out and look at the regulatory compliance around the leveraging the information over and over again, creating a consistent process so that when regulators and financial reporting needs come up, that you have that information available to show the auditors, to show your own financial managers within your organizations. It's something that when I think of the whole clinical trial financial management process from cradle to grave, to me, a lot of it comes back to how do you leverage that information over and over again to make better decisions, to make better financial planning decisions.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's underutilized across any organization is the business intelligence of what you get. And particularly to our conversation is the cost piece. So a lot of sponsors have all this data available, but again, I guess our problem is not data, is utilizing it correctly, right? So it's really, but we never go back and look at, which sites performed best, what were their costs, was it worth it, right? And not just the sites, but the procedures and invoiceables and things like that. So looking back at that business intelligence can really help to create better outcomes for the future, both in data and in costs as well. I think there was a question back there. Is there a question?
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
So
Can you
I
say your
believe,
name and where you're from?
I'm sorry, my name is Fabian Sandoval with Emerson Clinical Research Institute. I'm a site in DC, focused on minorities, diversity. So I believe I've used Grants Manager when the protocols come to me for review. Because if I believe this is the right platform, it says this is how much you're going to pay, and then we can put in how much we think we should get reimbursed, and then it goes back to you, and it comes back to us with a new number, right? That's
Grants
correct.
manager contracting.
Yeah,
Yep.
that thing is awesome.
Oh, great.
So yay, Medidata, because when we get them from other sponsors, I don't get it, and I have to build my own spreadsheet on Excel and look at the schedule of events. So I'm glad that's what it is, because it works really well. My question is, how do you determine overhead for a site?
So, there's recommendations within the system. So as we mentioned, all of our clients that use our products submit their negotiated data back to us, and it's what populates. So when our coders go through and review the protocols and the budgets, they're checking the overhead to see what was paid. And then within the system, you have the options of selecting the actual, what was in the protocol, what was actually agreed upon, and that's listed for every country within the system. So the sponsor has that option to take whatever, US is 25%. That's the recommendation for this oncology study, which probably isn't that, but but then it's ultimately up to the sponsor and CRO to decide what rate they want to go with as well. But there are recommendations that are given.
Sorry, Fabian. So with regard to the studies that don't come through Medidata that we don't have access to, and actually I don't have the same experience as Fabian where he was able to do that right on the spreadsheet on the platform, is there a way for a site to get that information so that when you're negotiating with, say, another sponsor who probably used the Medidata information, just didn't put it on the Medidata platform, is there a way for us to see that?
At this point, no. The tools that we utilize right now are for sponsors and CROs, and then if they're not using the negotiation tool with the sites, then there's no way to really see it. But I think we take this into account a lot of what we're designing. And yes, it's sold to the sponsors and CROs, but ultimately we want to make sure we're having smooth negotiations with sites as well, and that everyone's getting paid fairly. So that's where we work with sponsors and CROs to educate everyone on what might be the fair price, what can help speed up your negotiation timelines as well, so that you are getting paid fairly.
It speeds up so much. It really speeds it up.
Yeah.
I mean, it cuts it down to like maybe 1 or 2 days versus like a week or 2 weeks.
That's really great to hear.
If sponsors aren't using it, just from my own experience, please do, because it saved me so much time.
So do you see process differences in terms of how you negotiate with your sponsors for those sponsors that use site grants contracting or not?
Yes. So one of the issues that one of the differences that I see, first of all, besides the speed, it's the sometimes I don't have to call because you go back and forth through emails trying to organize what is the best budget. to the point where, if I send you 3 emails to try and figure out how much is a consent form, I'll just call and say, listen, I know you have stuff to do. Let me just figure, I don't want to give you a headache. This is how much it really cost us, and then give justifications for it. So if we can justify it with our language as to why it costs us so much, then it's doable. But with the grant manager platform, I haven't had to call. It's been very quick back and forth. I mean, and I just came back from another presentation where I showed from start to finish. By the time we got the feasibility questionnaire, so we actually had the first patient in, was 113 days. It took us 3 days for the questionnaire. It took us 23 days for the budget, and it took us like 90 days for the legal part. So that's what ate up most of our time, was the little bit of the budget and the legal, but it was super fast, everything else.
And if anyone wants to go check out and see what he's talking about, you can go to the demo station for demo grant management contracting.